Okay, so today I'm delighted to be joined by Amir Sokolowski, Global Director of Climate Change at CDP. Welcome, Amir.
Thank you very much. Lovely to be here.
CDP is a not-for-profit charity that runs a global disclosure system for investors, companies, cities, states, and regions. It used to be called the Carbon Disclosure Project, but shortened its name in 2013 as it expanded beyond carbon reporting. Uh, its disclosures cover 23,300 companies, which represent more than half of all market capitalization in the world. And we'll get on to your role at CDP in a minute. But first of all, Amir, if we could start with when did you first get involved in the climate agenda?
So probably around, it's very hard to put a pin in it, around 2006, 2007. I was doing human rights and we took affidavits from refugees. And all of the stories started with some or other climate-related issue. And it was the same time, I think, about an inconvenient truth, and many things coalesced to be recognizing that as an underlying problem to the one I was dealing with at the time.
Mm-hmm. So how did that progress then from refugees to broader climate issues?
Um, Well, continue. I didn't immediately abandon all refugees. I dedicated myself to learning a bit more about the topic, the relationship with, at first, um, an eventually futile attempt at the time to tie in. It's a very complicated world that we shouldn't go into right now, but how you define the status of refugee and if you can tie it in with environmental reasonings. And then I just went and studied it more in depth and studied law and environmental philosophy and how that works, and then picked up everything I could in the field in the, can't believe I'm saying this, more than a decade and a half since. Um,
And you were a legal advisor, is that correct?
I
For
was
quite some time
for,
before.
yeah, I was, well, a plethora of positions. So that's one of the most recent. So before CDP, I was one of the advisors to the chair of the least developed countries in the UN negotiations, one of a few. Um, I worked on the ground in, I think it's about 20, I can't remember, 20 or 24 global south countries, some of them least developed, some not, in everything from climate legislation to implementation of climate projects to mediation with between government and local tribes around climate legislation, etc., for many, many years.
Right, that sounds fascinating. Can you give us an example of that, particularly the sort of tribes and national governments?
In many cases, just to explain the context of why that happens. So in many cases, land ownership questions and general policy for on a national level are different from country to country. In some countries, such as Papua New Guinea, for example, where 97% of land is owned by various tribes, any attempt to negotiate, for example, with oil and gas sits with heads of local tribes and where they can work. Yet a national NDC has to go through a very complex and long-term strategy through a very, very complex system of stakeholder engagement. The same holds for legislation that impacts all of that ownership, because essentially you're limiting the capacity to use some of your own property. I'm being very reductive. So in many of those cases, they bring external consultants to come and to sit and to have a discussion around one or other element of environmental legislation. In this case, it was the climate change law,
Yeah.
which I think is still extant in Papua New Guinea, but I haven't checked in the last 18 months. And that was sitting with 6 or 7 ministries and with tribal elders. That happened in a few other countries as well around different projects, where it's not only their input, and because there's a question of indigenous knowledge and ownership, but it actually, climate environmental legislation actually impacts ownership rights and usages. It impacts future design. And therefore, in many cases, on what would seem like an uncontroversial issue, such as environmental and climate legislation or projects, they surface many older, I would guess, rivalries between different elements.
Right. So sometimes the climate is the symptom rather than the cause. That sounds
Yes.
fascinating.
Sometimes it's the symptom that brings along the need for the legislation, and sometimes the cure is stopped by "I don't trust you, this is my land," or "I don't trust you, you don't know what you're doing," or I'm again being very reductive, but broadly questions like that, and the international regime that's involved in that.
And did you learn any particular skills of negotiation? And that, 'cause that sounds extremely challenging, that you can apply to your career
Uh,
at present?
One that those who know me will say that I don't apply much, but probably should more, which is staying silent. Listening to people attentively often has more value than, well, in my opinion, this is the case, but rather, really, okay, you think that? That's interesting. What do you think? As silly as that sound, is quite often the best instrument.
Giving everybody their say.
Exactly, giving the space to everyone.
Excellent. So, Global Director of Climate Change, what does that role entail?
Um, it's well, it's a grand title. It's now, I think, because CDP is no longer regionally divided, so it's just director because there's no need for the global. There's one CDP, but so CDP is a complex entity, but what, in very reductive terms, what it tries to do is translate the social good, the public good value of environmental action into what our system would appreciate as financial value, and the ways that that takes on. So going to investors and saying, we believe that you should look at a company that if they're doing that, then they have a sustainable lifespan, they're acting better, they're planning better for the future. And we take into so you should ask us to ask them questions. I give that whole background to say that there are distinct roles within CDP for everything. The climate change director is the one in charge within thought leadership of defining the direction and strategy that we take to see what the next step is around climate. So if 10 years ago it was just getting a company to disclose what their inventory was, and then to disclose and focus on scope 3, and now to focus even more on supply chains and on transition plans, that's the remit of me and my team.
Right. Excellent. So when I was doing a little bit of research, I came across a news report from June last year that the CDP was sort of rattling a few cages, particularly around FTSE 100 firms, saying that their transition plans weren't up to scratch. So calling the gap between ambition and delivery worrying. So in the last however many 8 months, has that improved at all?
Well, it's important to know that the disclosure cycle with us is annual.
Yeah.
So to know if that has changed, we'd have to analyze the data as it comes a year later. I'm trying to remember, there were quite a few reports that we released and were released around us, but a general answer would be COP 28 and regulatory changes in the world and winds and countervailing winds have brought a lot of change in the last 12 months.
Yeah.
So even though I've only been in climate for the last, I can't remember now, 15 or 16 years, the rate of change in the last 5 is something I've never seen before. What would usually have taken 3, 4, 5, 6 years before that now can take 6 months.
Right.
I tend to believe the answer is yes, but I don't have the data yet to give
Yeah.
that comparison.
But the government's made a big thing of mandatory reporting from FTSE 100 firms, so it was something when I saw it, I thought I'd better
Well,
ask about.
CDP tend to be involved in quite a lot of, not involved, but rather consulted around what mandatory reporting should look like. We sit in some of the working groups in the transition plan task force, for example. We work closely with the IFRS on a more global scale and EFRAG in Europe. So in all of those, it's not so much the question of newspapers seek the sort of either the leaders, the example of a wonderful angel, or the laggards, the terrible sort of evil devil that you're trying to capture through the cracks. But actually, most of regulation is a question of guidance for those in the middle that are not climate leaders or laggards, that would like to do the right thing but are not climate specialists and just lack the guidance.
Yeah.
In much of our work, we try and sort of stress that point. You have not done well on this perhaps next year you will do that, as opposed to you are the devil or you're a divinity. Sorry, I'll stop there.
No, it's quite all right. Feel free to talk at length on these points, but you mentioned thought leadership. What's the current messages you're trying to get across to industry?
I think first and foremost, and I realize it's a little bit ironic for a climate director to say this, but the climate is one aspect of environmental impact of
Mhm.
companies. As you mentioned, CDP is no longer, even though we're quite often mentioned as this, no longer the Carbon Disclosure Project, but rather CDP because the brand works. But actually, the intention in the coming years, and I don't mean 15 years, I don't even mean 5 years.
Mhm.
The intention is to conceive of environmental impact as one holistic view that has several facets. Um, and the companies, I would like to sort of take this platform or any others and say companies tend to see that in fear. They think that there's a place where, oh my God, it took us X years to get used to reporting on climate. Now we have to additionally report on nature.
Yeah,
That's not the case. It took us X years to report on your impact on a certain environmental harm. This is just a honing of that. It's
yeah,
the same mechanism. Science inevitably advances. Our understanding of impacts and interactions inevitably advances. And this is just that next step.
yeah.
So that's the first. The second, sorry, you can indicate if you want me to shut up or speak at length.
No, no, keep talking.
Um, the second one would definitely be an expansion or a focus on supply chains.
Yeah,
So going to be very cautious and to express that I am no longer and have been for many years a human rights expert, and I'm not claiming that that is the case. However, we cannot just put all of our emissions, all of our environmental harms outside of a certain jurisdictional supply chain,
yeah,
jurisdictional area. So we have to focus on our supply chain, but we also don't want a situation in which we look at the supply chain, there's massive competition in the world. We take work away from a certain place because they're not yet there.
mhm,
It isn't necessarily the job of the private sector in the world as we conceive it to take care of the capacity building of its supply chain. What we are trying to encourage, and this is by no means just CDP, but it's definitely the next focus, is a better understanding along supply chain, A, where the failures are, B, that we aren't just NIMBYing our treatment, and C, that there is a way in which we can actually develop the entire world equally and fairly and not viciously and arbitrarily, as in I found someone else that does what is in accordance
yeah,
with. And very tied to that is the third point, which is at least CDP's geographic expansion. A focus currently on I think Southeast Asia. I say I think in the sense of a focus on where there's the greatest impact. Obviously, everywhere in the world deserves the same level of
yeah,
focus, but we are an NGO. And so we can focus resources to a certain extent when we can. Obviously, we work in Latin America, North America, Europe, the UK, MENA. We have signatories and reporters in Africa and many, many, many in Southeast Asia. But we have to learn to focus on particular problems in particular areas. However, that's not to say that's the way the world should go, but the expansion of the focus on the capacity to develop low carbon pathways in the global south
yeah.
is that sort of third pillar. I think they all tie in quite well together.
Yes, but a lot of it's about that sort of concept of carbon leakage of
Exactly.
um, and I don't know whether you've got a view on this, but obviously the EU brought in the carbon border adjustment mechanism, CBAM, in October. The US and the UK are considering similar measures. I know the UK government is actively consulting on such a border mechanism at the top. Do you have any idea of how much that might change the that playing field internationally?
I don't know if any of my colleagues are listening, but if they are, they're gonna laugh at the fact you asked to have an opinion. It's like one of the things that I rant about. I think preventing of leakage is a really, really important element. It fits in
Mm.
with the same sort of concept of we don't want to just move the problem around. it has to be modified by equity and fairness, which in turn cannot be used as a shield for lack of action. I'm saying these because they happen quite a lot.
Yeah.
I think on a practical level, it's going to all of these, and I'm assuming they will pop up like mushrooms after the rain. All of these tariffs or instruments are going to be subject to a scrutiny, and the world is going to ask the question of, is this a protectionist, unfair regime, or is this something in the common good? And I'm very much hoping that the world will move to it being a common good. I give all of that to say I'm very much in support of the concept of CBAM. It has to be done correct, or its equivalents. It has to be done correctly. It has to be done in harmonization. And it has to be one of a much broader array of instruments governing, I would argue, a larger move and understanding of what environmentally conscious, environmentally positive global trade looks like. It's a place in which the world has been quite conservative. And to allow that and to incentivize that. So yes, I think as one of an array of instruments, absolutely.
Yeah.
Brilliant instrument.
But it will hopefully incentivize some of those countries in the global south with large manufacturing base, to think about where their energy is going to come from. If it's, if they continue as some have done down the coal route, it may, make people think twice because it may make their industry less competitive rather than more.
I think if we look at theories of change in an ideal world, I'm not saying this is how it'll work, and again, cognizant that it's quite reductionist, but we're looking at explicitly two cycles of a theory of change that we want to happen. We don't want us to be looking at, say, for example, a massive production plant in India that's based on coal and say, well, immediately, well, we're leaving there. We want that plant to have an impact on regulation that will move its grid out of coal. That's definitely one. But also cognizant of where capacity lies currently in terms of financial means. We would like a universe in which your supplier engagement includes an investment of your finance as a big buyer, for example, that you would help them move away.
Yeah.
That you would move your suppliers away, or at least provide them with a pathway or an incentive or a financial access to capital that would be easier for them to use to do so.
Yeah.
That is definitely the case.
Sort of a creating shared value approach of, in investing for the common good.
Absolutely. But defining that, I hesitate to say this because coming from the climate world and human rights, before that, I am a bleeding heart. But not just in that, I do acknowledge the economic system and how it works. There's value to having a comparable, transparent action where you can create a race to the top. You are a wonderful corporation, not only because you have zero emissions and you save the dolphins, but rather because you have a long-term, what would be perceived to be dull, but investment in the entirety of your supply chain along it, which in turn will impact those around it. Because if one big factory in country X can do it, it creates a pathway and an example for other companies in the same sector, in the same region to do it and have their capacity. This is the idealized theory of change. I realize that there are hurdles.
Yes. And where do you see the CDP's role in that?
I wish I was newer at CDP, because when I was newer at CDP, I could differentiate between what I think the CDP role is in that and the way that is external, but now Amir has sort of internalized CDP. It goes to questions of how we believe human nature works. It's not what's necessarily the immediate answer that I think you expected me to give, but I don't believe that human beings are inherently evil, nor that they're inherently good. I think that given the choice, they would do the good if they could. I think CDP translates that abstract concept into very concrete financial incentives and directions. So where does CDP fit into that? A few places. First of all, putting the pressure on those that are leading, or not even the pressure, making the suggestion on those that are leading in the field, saying, how about focusing on that with your suppliers?
Yeah.
Come report it to us. We will let others see that you do that in creating that market, but also in doing so comparably. And CDP has held, I guess, the pen and what good environmental action and environmental impact management, I guess, is the complicated way to should and can look like.
Yeah.
And in defining that as part of it, it enhances the action. Not as a guidance, again, not because I think companies are trying to avoid it or are dedicated to it, but rather because I don't know, a fashion product manufacturing company does not specialize in climate and needs guidance in order to do that. I don't know if that's an answer to your question, but I'll.
No, I think it is a very good one. I noticed the CDP were before COP28, we're talking about the importance of data quality. And obviously there's a trade-off there because you want as good data reported as possible, but also there's no such thing as perfect data. And you could spend infinite resources hunting the holy grail of perfect data. So where do you think or do you have any thoughts on where the balance lies between data that's good enough?
So a simple, easy to answer question. I think you're right. I think there is a place where an abundance of data, as we've seen in everything, right? We've gone from a place where there's absolutely no data, and that's why we don't know things, to a flood of data, which means we know sometimes even less because we don't know what is right and what's wrong and what's relevant. I think data is valuable when it tells part of a coherent story.
Yeah.
So thank you. You've sort of, I realize this is not what perhaps you intended to do, but this helps guide and answer the previous question. CDP's role is to fashion enough of a coherence. It's worth explaining a few points about data. There's a data point, there's a data set, and then there's the use of a data set and the whole story that is built around that, the coherence, accountability that is associated with particular data sets. Data points are incredibly important, but they're not valuable sitting on their own necessarily. Much like, well, I can use any mundane example, but I keep going back to eating because I personally love chocolate cake. You can't ask a person only what they eat to see if they're healthy, or you can't ask them how much they exercise to see if they're healthy. You have to ask a coherence of data. And it gets increasingly complicated to extensions that I am not aware of. I don't know how to go into. So the same is true of climate. The data is valuable when it's put within a certain context. There are two contexts. There's the context of the story. Do you have a good transition plan? And there's the context of how good is your transition plan compared to 4,000 other transition plans? So the honing of each other.
Yeah.
It stops being useful when it's so detailed as to give value to no one who isn't exactly you in that sector, in that country, in that region, in that stage of production.
Yeah.
So it is an objective point of where that use case. My first degree was history, and in history, in order to learn it, it's not actually memorizing of dates. You have to understand what the context is of all of them. So it's that, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. It's an interesting thing. One of my clients is one of your 23,000 businesses and a pretty big one. And they say that I think not just CDP, but the whole raft of various different reporting structures they've signed up to, it's 50% of their sustainability team's time is compiling and submitting returns to the various programs that the business has signed up to. So uh, I sometimes get that little bit of frustration that they'd rather spend more time doing stuff, actually implementing the plan rather than.
But there are two. I'll give both. I entirely see the point, and I've
Yeah,
heard that it's called the reporting burden,
yeah,
essentially. And there are two elements. On the one hand, there is every dollar I spend on reporting is a dollar I'm not spending on doing.
mhm,
I understand the logic of that. To an extent, it's true. To an extent, it's a shield. And I'd like to give both sides. So on the one hand, you're right. If I have to report to my initiative to the 7 governments with whom my business works with, and to a standard, and to yet another standard within those, what is the coherence that's happening? One of the things that CDP is trying really, really hard to do, and bearing in mind that we work in data, my next sentence is going to be very, very harsh, because working in data is not a sexy area. Even less sexy, and even more important within that, is harmonizing between different data sets.
yeah,
We are cognizant of the importance of harmonizing that data so that you can report a minimum that's still credible, and yet CDP tracks your progress for different initiatives while also enabling you to report and tracking that not as a compliance mechanism, but at least as a preparation mechanism for different legal regimes or standards.
mhm,
Certainly. CDP does the third thing as well, which is also one of the burdens that we try to address, which is saying there's one standard for the production of carbon credits, there's another standard for the use of carbon credits, there's another standard for what targets those credits are allowed to be used with, and there's another standards for how you count against which you're even allowed to count or not to count. Each one of these is a particular niche, and what do I report to? And what we try and do, and announced also in COP, is create, for example, for that, but we do so in a few things, a sort of a coherent, the life of a carbon credit from beginning to retirement.
yeah.
Um, so on the one hand, I see that issue, and we do try and resolve it. On the other hand, I also don't. It's not true that $1 on reporting is one. We all know that when we are obligated to do something, it doesn't only mean that we sit down to do the report, we also do the actual thing.
Yeah.
Climate action over the last 35 years has proven nothing if not the fact that a lot of times we give pledges and don't do them. Because that's what human beings do,
Mhm.
right? I was going to go for a jog at 6 o'clock this morning. That did not happen, but I said that I would. I'm definitely doing it tomorrow. I'm
Yeah.
not even saying that people have to be malevolent for that. And to a large extent, doing something you don't want is exactly how the climate action, like this is exactly the same argument that was made in 2000 saying, well, we already do financial reporting and we've been doing so since,
Yeah.
I've recently heard the 16th century. I don't know if that's true. There was accounting in 1492 or something. Um, we've already been doing that. Why do we have to add that element? So to an extent, sometimes the complaint is right, but it has to be within its context. Sometimes it's also just against having to do more.
Yeah, very good. And you mentioned or you alluded to the ranking of CDP returns. Do you see those ratings as a spur towards higher ambition?
You mean, I assume you mean our scores.
Yes.
So if CDP was born by environmentalist activists trying to find a pathway that does something, and then the questionnaire was born and everyone identified, but it is essentially we're a climate or an environment, we're not a climate, we're an environmental NGO. The same is true of scores, right? Scores are not the be all and end all that we intended to be. They're an incentive.
Mhm.
CDP CDP is supposed to be a guiding tool. Look at our questionnaire. We ask you the questions. They're not just asking you if you've done it. They're also telling you, perhaps you should consider this. This is the pathway forward. That's a central ethos for CDP. It's more that we want every, unlike other, and they're not the same because we're not a rating agency, but unlike rating agencies who want there to be a differential.
Mhm.
In an ideal world for CDP's mission to sort of sync, we want everyone to get to an A.
Mhm.
Are they an incentive? Absolutely, yes. And again, a dual-edged sword. I think you figured out this stage that I never answer anything simply. And I don't know if you'll cut half of this out, and that's fine. But
No, no.
I think on the one hand, yes, they're an easy to catch incentive.
Yeah.
I want to get an A. Great. Here's the way. You can make that goal. Well done. On the other hand, it's sometimes overly simplistic. And we every year try and work on making it more reflective of the actual effort and the actual impact and the actual progress that's been made. But sometimes it's a little bit simplistic. And it also, yeah. So yes, definitely, people love scores, but the intention for us is for everyone to get as high as possible.
Yeah.
Whatever.
And if everybody achieved A, would you have to create an A star
Well,
or
I think
recalibrate your scores?
if everybody achieved an A in a world in which I'm a firm believer in sunset clauses, i.e., if there's an NGO that exists for a certain purpose and you've achieved that purpose, I
Yeah.
think the NGO should retire. If we were in a world where 100% of companies were reporting to us and they had zero environmental impact, I'd be like, some government should take this over, but you really don't need an NGO at this stage.
Well, as a
But yeah,
sustainability consultant, I always say my life's ambition is to make myself redundant.
exactly.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah.
We should share a beer when we both make ourselves redundant.
Unfortunately, I think that might be post-mortem.
Oh,
Uh,
yep.
so I think you've kind of answered this, but overall, are you optimistic or pessimistic about decarbonisation?
I had a question about faith recently, generally faith, religious faith. I find faith very difficult, but I'd love to have some. And this is a little bit like faith, but also if faith is the opposite of evidence, then it's also the opposite of faith. I don't know what the pathway is for everyone to decarbonize. And evidence to date says we've been acting too slow,
Mhm.
for sure. But evidence to date also says that our rate of action is increasing. There's an interview with Christiana Figueres, actually with the founder of one of the founding chairs of CDP, who's Paul Dickinson, but where she says the purpose in Paris, the 2050 is a random date,
Yeah.
and we know that it's potentially too late. But the purpose was to get the ball rolling with an understanding that the world will roll so much faster once it's gone than what they think they can do.
Mhm.
And in that, I have faith in humanity. I've seen us do so for stupid things. 35 years ago, that's nothing. 35 years ago, the concept of a mobile phone. And yet now, and what infrastructure did we have to set up? How much do we complain if we don't have 5G for 3 seconds while walking through a park? But also,
On a mountainside.
on a mountainside, God forbid. Or
Yeah.
if the Wi-Fi that I have on my flight on the way to something that I really have to work for 1 second is not like super streaming, and then you catch yourself and you say, "Oh my God, I'm an idiot."
Mhm.
But I also look at, you know, the time that happened between Lindbergh crossing the Atlantic in 1927 and the first commercial flight to do so in 1936. I'm going to say 9 just to be safe, but I think it was 6. The speed in which New York City emptied from horses. Humanity's capacity to change to the unimaginable is brilliant. There's a feminist philosopher whose name begins with an S, and I can't quickly Google now as I'm speaking to you, and I can't remember her name, but she said, and I loved it, people often mistake the unimaginable for the impossible. So
Yeah.
I'm optimistic. On the other hand, I'm also terrified because we also have the capacity to adapt to amazing things. And at a certain stage, we might just say, well, to hell with it. I'm just going to adapt. So that's my fear.
Yeah. Although I think they the sort of flames of extreme weather starting to lick around our feet a little bit, I think the minds will keep getting focused
Hopefully.
on the requirement for action. And sometimes I worry personally that we obviously need the 1.5 target and all the rest of it, but that the people feeling that if we're not going to, get to 1.5 or 2 degrees of warming, then action's pointless. And I always say, no, every kilogram or ton less carbon emissions or fewer carbon emissions emitted makes the world slightly less bad. So we've got to do these things, no matter whether it's a drop in the ocean or not. It'll, um, it's not a binary win lose
Mm,
situation. It's where we end up that matters.
I agree. I think you've nailed on the head. I agree, and I have that fear with the 1.5 as well. And then I keep on telling myself that sometimes people are geniuses without noticing. Like sometimes I arrive at a conclusion, and then I look back and I realize a scientific paper was written about that 15 years ago, and I've now just like, oh my God, and people are like, oh my God. So the every fraction of a degree by the IPCC, and I think it was 2018,
Mm-hmm.
is now one of my biggest, exactly to quote what you're saying. Um, if I'm challenged on the 1.5, I say I don't know, and there might be overshoot, which is a useful term. But either way, every fraction of a degree matters.
Yeah, absolutely. So sort of optimistic, would if going back to a binary answer for a non-binary question.
Yeah, well, no, optimistic is not a binary answer. I'm optimistic but worried.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
that
and
is,
and I think as many of us are. I don't think, could you work in our field if you weren't optimistic?
yeah. Well, that's very true as well. And but I'm just thinking about that statement you've made a couple of times that the rate of acceleration is just incredible now. And there's always quite a lot of noise obscures the signal. Uh, we get constant newspaper articles saying, "Oh, EVs won't work in the winter," and then people say, "Well, how come Norway's the biggest market for EVs in in Europe?" And it's just yeah. I try and focus on the signal rather than the noise, I think.
And it's hard to do. I would agree with you. I mean, it's funny that every language that I speak has an expression akin to, you know, when we can fly, that'll happen. And that's a leftover of the time before we can fly, which is not actually that long ago, but we can fly, guys.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, a lot of that noise is superfluous, and a lot of that noise, even if it's factually correct at that moment, doesn't take into account unknown technological advances. But I do want to, sorry, make one point. I know that you're about to wrap up. I do want to make one point that always worries me. I trust in technology, and I hope the technology will help us get out of it, and I'm sure that to a large extent it will. But this is not to mistake my optimism only for technological advances.
Hmm.
Humanity has moved away from its own practices several times in the past and into others. And I believe that it's not only technology, but also practices and understanding of value. We keep on knocking financial systems, and we should, but actually our understanding of what's valuable and good in the world has changed in the last 100 years, let alone 500 and 1,000 years,
Hmm.
unimaginably. And I have faith that we will again.
Right. Well, on that positive note, I think we should wrap up. So thank you very much, Amir. That was quite a philosophical conversation to have. I think very important and intriguing. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Gareth. It was a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.